Hi, my name is Vickie Fairchild, and today we are going to talk about data. Woo! No one is cheering out there. No one wants to talk about data. But we need to talk about data because data is misunderstood and it leads to a lot of issues in the IEP meeting. So I'm going to bring up the chart that everyone hates, the bell curve chart. We hate this chart. We all hate this chart. That I have brought out at I don't know how many IEP meetings to attempt to explain the data to parents. And we're going to try to do that today. But before we get to the bell curve chart, and before we talk explicitly about those numbers, I need to say something to parents. And this is it. Your child is more than numbers. I know that. I know that your child is charming. I know that your child delights you. I know your child gives you hugs. I know that you were excited when you were pregnant and that you just want everyone to see the perfection that is your child. I know that you understand that all children are perfectly imperfect and that the imperfections in any of us do not take away from the worth of our intrinsic worth and our value that we have as human beings. And I need you to know that I understand that. If we were to give everyone all the tests in the world, we'd all come out with strengths and weaknesses. The hardest part of the IEP, I believe, is when you see those strengths and weaknesses in black and white. When those strengths and weaknesses are a set of numbers that are very sterile and seem to reduce your child to something you don't feel represents your child at all. Your child is perfectly imperfect, just like all of us. And I see that, and I see that charm and that love you have for your child. And I want you to know that most of the people I know hate having to present these numbers and be so analytical and sterile about a child's performance. It's what's required, and it's not a very fun part of the IEP. We have to justify why we are giving services or providing help to a child that is different than general education assistance. And so that's why it's required. One day, maybe we'll get to the point where we can just say, the child needs help, so let's get the child help. Maybe one day. But for now, we have to do a lot of testing, especially at an initial IEP, and then subsequently if the child qualifies at subsequent IEPs and triennial IEPs. And these testing reports, they do not feel good to parents, and I apologize for that because it reduces someone you love to a set of numbers, and it's not right. I hope we can change it one day, but until then, I want you to be able to look at and understand these numbers. I want you to be able to use those numbers to help your child and to better understand where your child's strengths and weaknesses are. So, let's talk about this paper that you maybe have seen several times. So, I'm going to give you a trick to start out with. If you look at this, I'm going to bring up the paper again, and you look at the types of scores that are down that column, there are so many ways that scores are reported. This is something that I think is detrimental to the understanding of the data that parents have. Because scores can be reported scaled scores, standard scores, percentile ranks, T-scores, stay nights, all of these different ways that scores can be reported. Now, as a parent, I want to teach you one question that I want you to ask. And the question is this: what is the percentile rank? Now, hopefully, the professionals are putting the percentile rank next to that scaled score or standard score. That's something I started doing. um, because percentile ranks is something that we are trained from the time we have our child to understand. Your child is born, they weigh the child, and they tell you where they fall in the percentile. And it's almost funny because early on, parents love saying things, well, my child was at this percentile for weight and height and all these things. And so we kind of get a sense that a higher percentile is better. I don't know why that's better with weight and height. And a lower percentile is, we get that it just means lower than average. Now, and again, I don't get that with weight and height. It just is what it is. But it's kind of a funny thing among moms. I was a mom of a 10.5-pound baby at birth, and I was surprised at how many people were like, wow. And I always wondered why that was such a good thing to have such a large baby, because there were so many clothes we couldn't wear. Anyway, I digress. But we kind of understand the percentile rank. So where does that percentile rank come from? So when they are creating a test, they create something they want to test. And let's say it's vocabulary. And a test creator will come up with a list of vocabulary words. Then they will test and norm that vocabulary test on, let's say, 100 6-year-olds. And they give that test to 100 6-year-olds, and they find out what the average 6-year-old can do as far as defining those vocabulary words. And so then they come up with this data set of this norming. So as a professional, what happens is I give that vocabulary test to a 6-year-old, and I look at my little chart in the back of my test manual, and it says, oh, the child's defined 14 of those words, and 14 words falls at what is often reported as a scaled score. Let's say a scaled score of 8. Now, as a parent, a scaled score of 8 might not mean anything to you. And this is when I want you to ask your question, what is the percentile? And so a scaled score of 8 would be a percentile of 25. And so you know that your child is falling kind of in the average, maybe a little bit on the lower end of average, in their ability to define words. So 25 of 100. That's fine, that's great. But percentile kind of puts it in perspective. For most of the tests you get, percentile, low will show you a weakness, up to high will show you a strength. And that's a good metric for parents to understand, the percentile. Because if you look back at, upside down, sorry, the bell curve, you can see all of these numbers can kind of make your head spin. But if you just focus on that percentile, that will give you an idea. And now I'm going to do a caveat. Except for the ends of the bell curve. My opinion is we do not we never test enough children or enough adults to differentiate really well at the ends of the bell curve. I remember once I tested a gifted child because I just wanted to, and I was surprised because her scaled scores, she was a younger child, the highest scaled score she could get, even though she was almost perfect on the assessment, was a 14. And that was because of the 6-year-olds, or 7, I can't remember how old she was, that they had tested, they weren't able to get to those extremes. And we'll see that sometimes as psychologists, and it's really hard to explain to parents, where they'll say, well, a scaled score of 1, if a child gets between 0 and 7 correct, they might get a scaled score of 1, which would fall at the first percentile. However, there's a difference in that instance with a lower score between the child who gets the 0 correct and the child who gets the 7 correct. That sometimes comes out more later as we test kids who have some cognitive delays as they get older, and we're able to differentiate better between those kids who struggle in certain areas. And so it's really, again, it's based on a norming sample. So while it's useful information, and as a parent it tells you something, it is not your whole child. It just tells you strengths, it tells you weaknesses, it tells you what we can work on, but again, it's not your whole child. Your child is more than a set of numbers. Your child is more than the bell curve. Unfortunately, we have to do these tests so that we can identify those strengths and weaknesses. So again, as a parent, when you're sitting in that meeting and they're bringing those out, ask for that percentile. If you're not understanding what the psychologist or the speech therapist or the occupational therapist or the resource teacher or the special day class teacher is telling, ask them for that percentile. Sometimes that percentile is going to be hard to hear, but that will give you an idea of where you can focus your energy. Now, one of the things that I want to point out that can be a little tricky when we're talking about percentiles is this. When we're talking about positive behaviors or skills, such as vocabulary or cognitive reasoning or all these other skills that are more positive, memory, executive functioning, all of those skills, higher percentiles are better. Okay, does that make sense? So when we're talking about positive skills, higher percentiles equal strengths, lower percentiles equal weaknesses. However, when we are talking about behavioral, and they're often in behavioral weaknesses, higher percentiles equal a weakness. So if your child is suspected to have ADHD and you fill out a rating scale, and the teacher fills out a rating scale, and you come out with higher, they're usually reported in T-scores, and percentiles that are above the 75th, above average, that would mean that your child has an issue with hyperactivity. That would mean your child may have an issue with defiance. That would mean your child may have an issue with inattention. And so when we're talking about skills that may be considered deficits, higher percentiles indicate the presence of that behavior. Does that make sense? I hope so. So, but again, coming back to percentiles, percentiles are just easier for parents to understand. 1 being lower, the lowest, up to 99. Again, we all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And those percentiles help us identify those weaknesses and where they come from. But your child, your precious little baby that you brought home from the hospital is more than those percentiles. It's more than that data. So when you come home and you've had that hard IEP with those low data scores, let it sink in, go hug your child, and continue to be an awesome parent. That's what you can do. Know that they're just required, but your child is more than those numbers. Your child is worth is infinite. And your child just needs you to love them and accept them for exactly who they are. And maybe we can one day burn all the data.